Thing.
Welcome to One Work, Five Questions with Dr. Mark Holochak. That is he. And your host, Donna Vitek. That is I. Or
And
can I say me?
I have Mount Olympus in the background for reasons I'll explain later when we're talking about what is
Oh,
the sublime.
okay. Okay. Oh, I can't wait. I can't wait. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Holochak. You've had quite the busy week. Weren't you on a trip to Georgia? You want to tell
Georgia,
us a little
yeah,
bit
I was
about that?
at the Abbeville conference and I gave a wonderful talk on Thomas Jefferson, what he did to end the pernicious institution of slavery. And I tried to show all those people who argued Jefferson could have done more, that they were wrong, that Jefferson did an abundance of things to try to end slavery at some point, and he should be lauded for his efforts in that regard instead of castigated like people commonly do. But it's hip, or it's fashionable today to just criticize the founding fathers. You know that.
Yeah. Did somebody recorded this though, right? We'll be able to watch
Yeah,
the
it'll be
talk.
up on. It's on Abbeville. It'll be up on
Okay.
YouTube in due time.
Okay, the Abbeville channel on YouTube.
Right. And
Okay.
we'll talk about maybe next week when we do our show. I'll see if it's
Okay.
up yet. And I'll let you know. But
Okay, great. Yes, I can't wait. I love your I know I found one of your talks before we met, and I think I watched it probably 10 times. You're such a good speaker.
well, this
Yeah,
one
so if
went
you,
went very well from my estimation. I had a very inviting and vigorous audience. They participated well, and yeah, so I was lucky to be invited, and I want to thank the people from Abbeville for having me and inviting me. Sold a lot
I
of
think
books, so
I think what makes your talk so good is because you're the world's foremost authority on the mind of Thomas Jefferson.
I hope. I'd like to think so. Maybe. Yeah. Um, got a lot of books. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, you're up to how many now?
27. I got two others, but I bracket that to the mind of Thomas Jefferson because I'm more of a philosopher than I am a typical historian. Like I don't go digging for new information. That I look at stuff that other people have wrote and analyze it and try to come up with different takes on it. They're the right take. What did Jefferson mean when he wrote this? When people interpret it in a multiplicity of ways. So I have a different approach to doing history. It's called analytic history.
I like it.
All
I
right, what are
like
we doing today?
Oh, today, I don't know. What are we doing today? I'm
I
joking.
hope so.
I need to change screens. Oh, the eyes, the eyes. Today, in honor of the unseasonably mild February much of America is having, we look at a letter Thomas Jefferson writes to his granddaughter, Ellen Wayles Randolph, dated the 10th of July, 1805. Ellen writes her grandfather concerning confusion about the seventh fine art, which neither she nor her mother can remember. That leads Thomas Jefferson to some discussion of the confusion among scholars on the number of definitions of fine arts and the particular fine arts. I am Donna Vitek, and this is One Work, Five Questions, episode 74.
Yeah, we're
Wow,
getting there.
we're getting there.
Inching
Before
towards that century mark.
right? I know. I think I have more gray hair now than from when we started. Before beginning, I remind listeners of the aim of this program. We look at one particular writing of Thomas Jefferson and either examine it thoroughly to see what other scholars have not seen, or we critically analyze some portion of the letter as a springboard for further discussion.
Well
So,
said. Well
are
said.
you?
Well said, Don.
Oh, you're funny.
No,
Question.
no, I'm being serious. That's what the show is. It's nice to tell our audience what we're doing, what we're aiming to do at least.
Yeah. Well, and showing off Jeffy. That's the best part.
He's not here. I've got my stray cat on the desk today. The one that anyways, I got a stray cat in the house and eating up all my food. He's a big chubby boy, but he's a
He'll
good
be
boy.
back. As soon as he hears my voice, he'll come running. Are you ready for question number one?
I guess so. Let's give it a shot.
Okay, to begin, tell us just a little about his granddaughter. Then can you tell us just what is a fine art? That is, what makes the particular fine arts part of the fine arts?
Okay, well, I won't say much about Ellen. Ellen was born in 1796, and this letter is when 1805. So she's still quite young.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, 1805. She's 9 years old at the time, and she's a very precocious young granddaughter. And if I may venture a guess here, she was very likely Jefferson's favorite granddaughter because she was so bright and so smart. And you look at some of the discussion about her, she might have been a bit uppity, a bit snobby because of her high intelligence and because she was related to Thomas Jefferson and all that. But that's all right. You know, smart people are that way sometimes. They're not all that easy. But anyway, she was young at the time, and she wrote a letter on the 4th of July in 1805, the same year, just sometime before Jefferson answered. She says, I have a question to ask you, her grandfather, that I did not put in my last letter. It is, what is the seventh fine art? I know 6 of them: painting, sculpture, architecture, music, poetry, oratory, but Mama nor myself either cannot recollect the seventh. So she asks about what is the seventh fine art. And Jefferson, as I'll talk about, is going to introduce at least 8, possibly 9 fine arts, if you include rhetoric as a part of oratory. Now, Jefferson has 3 categories in his library that relate to, following Francis Bacon, the philosopher, they relate to 3 categories of human capacities. One is human memory, one is human reason, and one is human imagination. With respect to memory, we have history. History deals with past figures, past events, and we use memory when we do history. With respect to our rational faculties, we have philosophy. In philosophy, Jefferson means something broader than what we mean today. He's going to talk about the sciences today, the sciences of investigation, natural philosophy, so forth. And then imagination deals with the fine arts because it's unconnected with rationality per se. And so you asked the question, what makes a particular fine art a fine art at large? It doesn't answer to reason. I have for Jefferson the faculty of taste, or the aesthetic sense, which is a faculty whereby I see something, judge something to be beautiful or sublime or its opposite. And through that faculty, I make judgments concerning beauty or its lack, sublimity or its lack. So Jefferson thought everybody had such a faculty. And a fine art is something that conduces towards the sense of pleasure. When I experience it, when I sense it, I feel when it's beautiful or sublime, it causes pleasure or even fear in me if it's sublime. If it's not beautiful, there's a sense of revulsion. So it's a sensory faculty in some sense for Jefferson because it's a faculty. And it's a faculty whereby I judge something either to be beautiful or sublime or the opposite of that. So.
Interesting. I never thought of it that way, but it makes sense to classify it in that way. Question number 2. Thomas Jefferson talks about the confusion concerning the number of the fine arts. Why is there such bumfuzzlement?
Bumfuzzlement, yeah. We talked about there being no such word. It's a shame, isn't it? Bumfuzzle is a word, right? It's a verb, and bumfuzzled is an adjective, but there is, the best that I could ascertain, no noun form of bumfuzzlement. We need to campaign for bumfuzzlement. It's a pretty good, bumfuzzle is a good word too, but bumfuzzlement is an even better word. So there's confusion because the study of the fine arts, in some respects, even though Aristotle studied poetry and arts like that. It really is in Jefferson's day in its infancy. We have authors like Francis Hutcheson, Lord Kames, William Hogarth, other people, of course, writing about what is beautiful, what is ugly, what is sublime, what is the opposite of sublime. And there are many books coming out in Jefferson's day about that talk about beauty and sublimity and its lack. Hutchinson writes a book called An Inquiry into the Original of Ideas of Beauty and Virtue. And Hutchison talks of beauty being some admixture of uniformity and variety. Think of designing a flower garden, right? If you just put all sorts of flowers in one bed, it's of limited attraction to some sense because there's no variety. Whereas if I take the same bed and put some flowers, chrysanthemums in one place, and lilies in another, and I have flowers like, bulb flowers coming up early and other flowers, marigolds, for example, coming up later, and then sunflowers or whatever. If I work in variety and maybe some decaying logs and stones in place, I can come up with something that is beautiful. You can't have too much uniformity. You can't have too much variety.
Right.
Much variety leads to confusion. Too much uniformity leads to boredom. Lord Kames writes his, see if I have these books, Elements of Criticism. Can you see that?
Oh, yep.
Yep. I have
Elements of Criticism.
Right. And Hutchinson's book I have here, so if you can get that on picture, it's titled An Inquiry into the Original of Ideas of Beauty and Virtue. It's an early book, and Jefferson was very much influenced by Francis Hutcheson on all things. And then William Hogarth, whose book I have somewhere, I couldn't find it, writes, he gives us analysis of beauty, and he says there are principles of beauty that are, when I speak of a principle, it's not something so definitely articulated, but he says fitness, variety, uniformity, simplicity, intricacy, and quantity are the principles of beauty. In Hogarth is the first to introduce the serpentine or wavy line. Remember when he did our show last time, we talked about Maria Cosway art has a lot of flow and movement. She's using Hogarth's wavy line to create it's something very beautiful. And if you see, for example, at Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia, he has serpentine walls. Instead of walls just made of brick going on and extending, the walls will wave. They're made of one brick thick, and because they wave like a snake, you can actually have a wall that's one brick thick. In effect, use less bricks, because if you just tried to make it one brick thick and straight all over, it'd fall over. Right. So it's both functional and more beautiful. The same thing with the walkways and roundabouts at Monticello. They're all winding instead of just having straight paths. Right. So he introduces that, which might be construed to be a sort of feminine element in beauty. I don't know if you want to bring that in, but it is. There is something when we see of serpentine lines and curves in art, we do get a sense of movement, do we not? So those are three very important people. There are others at the time. Jefferson divides his fine arts are 8, perhaps 9 if we consider rhetoric. He divides them under belles letters, belles lettres, and beaux arts. Under belles letters are, speak in English, so pronounce it in English. Belles letters concerns criticism, oratory, speaking, and poetry. Now, criticism is sort of like a meta fine art, because criticism is an art used, all these use words, by the way. The criticism uses words to criticize the fine art. So it's like a meta fine art. It stands outside of, above the fine arts to criticize, and we use reason to criticize fine arts. Then on the other side, we have beaux arts, architecture, not using words necessarily, architecture, gardening, music, painting, sculpture. There are 5. So all things considered, there are probably 8 if we understand rhetoric to be a part of oratory. Architecture deals with building, gardening, obviously you know what gardening is. When it's dealing with beauty, we're talking about pleasure gardening, the pleasure gardens in England and France. Music oftentimes has lyrics, but the essence of music as a fine art is the melody. Painting and sculpture. Painting works with colors in two-dimensional space on a canvas of sorts. Sculpture works in 3-dimensional space, so it has certain advantages without the ability to, in Jefferson's day, so much the use of color. So there's confusion because a lot of people would say gardening's really not a, why is gardening a fine art? You know, and Jefferson's going to try to argue that it is. But what makes a fine art art? I didn't answer that question. Is that it's pleasing. It's something that it's in itself conduces to pleasure. I don't enjoy the fine arts because I get some return from it, other than the fact they're pleasant in themselves, right? If I'm running, if I'm jogging, I don't jog because I find jogging pleasant. I jog for health. If I'm enjoying music, I don't enjoy music for anything other than music. When it's done the right way, it's inherently enjoyable, right? Everybody has their own sort of music that they like. I like all. What sorts of music do you like? I mean, I like a lot of different genres.
I like everything.
I
I really like jazz.
You like jazz?
Yeah, I like jazz. I like classical music. Yeah. And I like classic rock and country.
Yeah, I like bluegrass too. Yeah. I'm starting to appreciate bluegrass these days. And some of those bluegrass artists are really quite talented musicians.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, these are things we appreciate. Essentially, it's called a fine art because it's done for relaxation, as Ames will talk about in his elements of criticism. When I enjoy a fine art, when I'm studying too much, my brain gets tired, so I kick back, as we say today, and listen to some music, and in some sense it relaxes and almost reinvigorates me so I can go back to studying or something. So so much for that.
Oh, question number 3. Thomas Jefferson comments that Lord Kames has recently shown that gardening is a fine art. Can you explain?
Well, I hope so. That's a good question. He says in there, what does he say in there? Yeah, rhetoric. Add gardening as a 7th fine art. I think Lord Kames has justly proved this to be entitled to the appellation of a fine art. It is nearly allied to landscape painting, and accordingly, we generally find the landscape painter the best designer of a garden. What does he mean? I think he's talking about a book that I've read. Does that come up? The Gentleman Farmer by Lord Kames, where he talks about, in the first half, the practice of farming. Then he talks about the theory behind farming, right? And now farming is not the same thing as gardening, because, and you notice he doesn't talk about farming / gardening, because the aim of farming is yield, is food. And you know, beauty is a secondary thing. If I'm a farmer, I'm interested in getting the best, most fruitful crop that I can get on a particular year, and I'm not concerned whether my crops, whether my fields are beautiful. So it's not necessarily the same, but I think he's talking about Kames and the Gentleman Farmer, or if not, he's talking about something in the elements of criticism, where Kames is talking about gardening. But gardening, certainly the pleasure gardens of his day. Let me see if I have some pictures I can bring up here under share screen. Yeah, let's look at just a couple pictures. One is, this comes up. This is the a French pleasure garden. Notice the complete perfect symmetry on both sides.
Yeah.
Right. And that was, the French sort of garden of the time of Jefferson. That's the sort of garden that you had. Now, I don't think I have a picture of a British garden. But on the other hand, the British gardens of his day did not have the same regard for symmetry. And I much prefer the British pleasure gardens. The idea behind the British pleasure gardens was to take a particular landscape with its hills and the sort of vegetation that's growing there, certain trees and shrubs and flowers, whatever. And instead of like you did with this French garden, you strip the land bare and then you create from nothing, ex nihilo, right? A garden. The idea behind a British pleasure garden would have been to work within the confines of the landscape. If there's a lake, we bring the lake into play. If there are beautiful tall oak trees, we bring those oak trees. We cut down many of the other trees and focus on. So the idea is to strip away and focus on some of the beautiful features of the natural landscape by just, instead of stripping everything and planting like the French would do, it's only stripping some measure of the things and allowing the landscape itself to be beautiful with the sort of natural living things that are growing there. See what I mean by that, the difference there?
Yeah.
So both involve principles of beauty. Let's go back to Kames and Hutchison. Uniformity among variety. If we look at the French pleasure garden, there's perfect uniformity and there's some degree of variety, but it's almost sort of boring and monotonous in its uniformity. Whereas the British garden itself would not be structured thus. It would be a matter of just working within a particular landscape, stripping things away, leaving other things behind, and focus on. You could add things to it as well, like a well or something, or a bench. But that's the difference between the two types of pleasure gardens.
Wow, it's really, I do see the artistic work with gardening. And I think not only with the beautiful shrubbery, but I think it can be with anything that you're gardening. You can find the beauty in how you plant things and the combinations of things you can plant together that help one another grow better.
You're talking about uniformity and variety again, right?
Yeah.
Knowing what sorts of things, there's a sort of regard for texture, for tall things, things that grow wide, things that are sort of chthonic, that cover the earth, plants that cover the earth, like mint or clover. So I mean, it was starting to become a sort of science in Jefferson's day.
Interesting. Okay, question number 4. How can there be an art of beauty if it is simply felt or sensed?
That's a tough question. So like criticism, there are no principles. There are principles in a sense. Let's go back to what Hogarth talks about: fitness, variety, uniformity, simplicity, intricacy, and quantity. There's no way of articulating, for example, quantity. If I'm growing clover, or if I'm covering a certain particular part of ground with strawberries or planting blueberry bushes, how many? Well, that all depends on the parcel of land that I have, the other things that I intend to grow or am growing. There's no answer to quantity. There's no way of expressing quantity or intricacy. Fitness, for example, for Hogarth would mean growing things that presumably work into a particular landscape, right? Jefferson brought back olive trees from his stint in Europe and wanted to introduce them to South Carolina and Georgia, I believe. And they just didn't take there. They are sickoline plants. They grow very nicely in rocky and dry soil and don't require a superabundancy of moisture. And they didn't work. So they didn't have fitness, right? You have to have a certain plant has to be accommodated to a certain environment. Now let's go back. You said if they're simply, so the idea is if when I see beauty, I just feel it. I look at something, the Mount Olympus is in back of me where, the gods, Zeus and his cortege, his fellow Olympian gods lived. I don't know if you can see them back there. If we look way in the back somewhere, Zeus is probably somewhere at the top hanging out there, doing something, maybe having an affair with a mortal or something. Anyways, but here we have a sense of sublimity about which I'll talk. But anyways, there's a sense of absolute beauty. When I see Mount Olympus, I'm just awed by it, struck by its sublimity in the sense of beauty. And that's that. I just feel it. But both Hutchison and Kames talk about absolute and relative beauty. Hutchison says absolute beauty, I understand only that beauty which we perceive in objects without comparison to anything external, of which the object is supposed an imitation or picture, right? So he's talking about absolute beauty, something I find in works of nature. Relative beauty is human artifacts. If I make a paper mache, remember when you went to school, we had to work with paper mache all the time?
Yeah.
Kids don't even know what that is. So I make a paper mache replication of Mount Olympus. And if it comes close to it, it looks like it, I can capture it. I can say it's beauty. It's beautiful in a relative sense, according to Francis Hutchison, right? Kames has a slightly, so I mean, I can get a sense of an art for beauty. I can apply my reason, even though reason really has no part in understanding something is beautiful. When I'm doing relative beauty, I can't. I can look at my paper mache and then I can use the principles that, for example, Hogarth gives me, fitness, variety, uniformity, simplicity, and ask if I've done a good job, or just simply compare it to the mountain that I see. Now, Lord Kames gives us a slightly different depiction of relative beauty and intrinsic beauty. He says intrinsic beauty is an object of sense merely. So far, he has perfect agreement with Hutchison. One sees, for example, a beautiful spreading Texas oak and sees that it's just a beautiful thing and is blown away by its beauty, right? Relative beauty, says Kames, is founded on the relations of objects. And in a sense, it's similar to what Hutchison was saying. I'm relating objects, but I can have a notion of relative beauty when I'm talking about nature. If I'm comparing a particularly beautiful oak tree to a particularly beautiful weeping willow, there's a sense of relative beauty. So I bring in principles of reason and can discuss the ways in which they're both beautiful in a relative sense. Or I can talk about relative beauty with respect to a beautiful landscape that I see and a landscape painting of that landscape. Jefferson, when he went to the pleasure gardens of England, took with him, let's get this book in if we can. It doesn't come in very well. Observations on Modern Gardening, okay, by Thomas Whately. He takes his book with him, and he's literally comparing what Whately says in the book with the landscape to see if Whately's so he's offering he's being critical with Whately's descriptions of these. And he winds up saying, well, Whately is pretty darn good the way he described them. But he can't just go and enjoy it, can he? He's got to take a book with him. Got to take this book with him and say, okay, let's see how good Whately did, right? So you have this notion of absolute and relative beauty, and with the sense of relative beauty, we can bring reason in, but it's not going to be a judgment in any absolute sense. When I look at Mount Olympus, or I look at let's bring up a couple other items. Here I have a beautiful Texas oak. I look at this sprawling, spreading oak and I say, wow, it's a beautiful thing. Okay. Look at, these are not the pictures I want here.
The cows are cute.
Yeah, those are some other pictures I had. Let me see if I can bring up a couple other pictures. I want architectural pictures, and let's do that. Let's bring up a couple. Okay, here we go. Here we have a Queen Anne style house, right? Which is not perfectly symmetrical and quite beautiful. It's got a nice large porch, right? Colors are a little fantastic, but you notice how we have in the front, we have some landscaping done, a minimal amount of landscaping, to beautify a pleasure garden, flower garden. But the focus here is on the house, not on the garden. Right. And if I can bring up other pictures, look at another sort of Federalist style. It's a modern house done in the Federalist style. Notice the perfect uniformity, right? 8 windows here, plus 2 here on the side. 4 windows here, 4 here, 2 on the side, 2 on the side. And in the attic area, we have 3 windows and so forth. Beautifully done, but perfectly symmetrical, except for the placement of the chimney, but everything is perfectly symmetrical. And one other picture here is what we'll bring up, and I'll lead this up as we move on to the last last question, right? I'll leave this picture up.
Okay, ready for number 5?
I guess so, yeah.
Okay, what is the difference between beauty and sublimity? Are both felt the same way?
Well, they're both felt. And the impressions I get when I'm exposed to beauty and sublimity are, for Jefferson, different authors write differently. And Jefferson gives us what I call an epistemology of the sublime. Beauty, I would discuss as something, and I don't mean to be sexist, there's feminine. It is flowing, it is intimate, it is inviting, it draws you in. There's flow, there's attractiveness, it's not intimidating in the least, it's inviting. Sublimity is masculine. It is, let's look at this picture of a Gothic, inside of a Gothic cathedral, right? It blows you away. It's intimidating. It's scary. It's dark. It's large. And it's the same thing with my, house is not like that. It's beautiful, but it's the same thing with Mount Olympus in the back. It's sublime. It's intimidating. It's scary. It's it's large. It's bulky. It's heavy. All these things. It's off-putting. But Jefferson, I think we've talked of this before, but he gives us what I call an epistemology of the sublime. He says sublime objects, once we get used to them, really sort of draw us into them. He talks about being atop the natural bridge. Right, he's on top. He goes, it's scary. You feel if you fell down, it's several hundred feet, and it's intimidating. It's frightening. There's a sense of beauty that pushes you away,
right?
And that's what sublime is. So when we talk about sublime today, we're talking about rather loosely, but it has a very particular meaning. It contrasts with beauty. Invites you in. It's small, it's feminine, it's not intimidating. It's just the opposite of things that are sublime. When you see Niagara Falls is sublime because the water rushes over it actually erodes the rock as it does over time and hits the ground. And it's a very frightening thing when you're real close to it. Okay, but Jefferson says, as we've talked about before, when we talk about beauty and sublimity, when we experience sublimity, it repulses us, but then after some period of acclimation, we're no longer afraid. We see the beauty in it. So there's a sense in which sublime objects are beautiful. It's a biological response from Jefferson. It's a natural, like when I see a snake, I recoil.
Right.
It's same thing with seeing the natural bridge or being over a cliff, looking over a cliff. You recoil and you're afraid. It's sublime, right? But if you get used to the cliff and you're not afraid of it anymore, you'll see, wow, it's really quite beautiful up here. So that's the different. In some sense, they're both felt, but they're not felt the same way. One is drawing you in, beauty. When I look at a flower garden, I showed people at my talk in Georgia some of my red poppies and some of my sunflowers, right? The beauty draws you in. Sublimity pushes you away. But Jefferson thinks that after a period of acclimation with the sublime, if you allow yourself to be acclimated, you're drawn to certain beautiful aspects. So,
wow.
Yeah, it is. Wow. It's
such wisdom, insightfulness. Yeah. Wow.
Mr. Jefferson was not that dumb of a guy, was he?
No, he was not. So I want to talk, while we still have some time, I want to talk about next week. We're going to stay within the fine arts. We'll be joined by artist Rhett Longmore, who will help us answer the question, what did Jefferson look like? Dr. Holacek, can you give us a teaser?
Yeah, I'm excited because Rhett is a Facebook friend of mine and we'll have him on the show. And I've been long admiring his artwork. He posts some of the stuff he does with metals, and he also paints. And some of the stuff is quite moving, quite good. And it'd be nice to get an artist's perspective. Now, we want to answer this question.
Right.
A lot of people say, you look at Thomas Jefferson and say, a lot of people say, well, Weston Hemmings looked like Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had to be his father. What did Jefferson really look like? You look at the various paintings, you get several depictions of Jefferson, and there's no particular agreement. And if you look at some of the verbal descriptions, you get inconsistencies as well. In one particular painting, we'll see one of the granddaughters says, well, that's an etude. I think it was Trumbull, actually, not the granddaughter says it's a study because it looks nothing like Thomas Jefferson. Well, so we'll have Rhett on the show and talk to us about techniques of artworks, painting, and so forth, sculpture, and walk us through and help us try to answer the question, see what did Thomas Jefferson really look like.
What a fun show that's going to be.
That should be. That should be.
Yes, that's going to be great. Okay, so if you're watching now, please give us a like and share our work with your friends. And if you have any friends that are artists, this would be a great episode to share with them, and also plan to watch next week when we have the guest on.
Thank you. And it's good to be back from Georgia, like I said. And I'm looking forward to the show because I always love to analyze art. I'm not a professional artist and I'm not a professional critic, but I have a lot of fun with art because I appreciate beauty and sublimity.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for a beautifully sublime talk today, Dr. Holacek.
Was it off-putting that it's sublime? Was it frightening?
No, you draw your listeners in, and then it's like
that's the beauty. I think you do more to draw people in than do I. Anyway, so much for that. We will see you next week in TTFN, as Catwoman said from Batman. Top for TTFN. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye, Dr. Holacek.